Everyone expected the father lion to kill them. What he did instead changed everything. In the wild, survival follows strict rules. Mothers protect their young, and male lions rarely stay. So, when a lioness walked away from her newborn cubs just hours after giving birth, everyone knew what would come next. The father lion was coming closer, and by every rule of nature, his arrival should have meant death. But that morning, under the hot Texas sun, something happened that no one was ready for. Something that would change what we know about strength, family, and what it truly means to stay. The morning came quietly to the high desert of West Texas, spreading a thin golden light across mesquite trees and cracked earth. In the distance, low hills held the night's last coolness like a secret, and the wind moved through dry grass with the soft sound of someone turning pages. This place, wide, fenced and watched, was called Red Mesa Wildlife Reserve, a private area of rough land where the wild still felt wild, even when cameras blinked from hidden spots and satellites traced invisible lines above. Beneath an old mesquite tree with a trunk like weathered bone, 3 tiny lion cubs lay pressed together in the sand. Their fur was still darkened and sticking in places. Their bodies were so small they looked like they belonged in someone's hands, not in a world that demanded strength. Their eyes were sealed shut. Their paws flexed and released as if they were dreaming of warmth that wasn't there. Every few seconds, one of them made a faint searching sound, more like a breath than a cry. Then it fell quiet again, as though saving what little energy remained. A few feet away, their mother stood perfectly still. Her name, at least to the people who tracked her, was Luna. She was a young lioness with a pale scar near her shoulder, and a sleek sand-colored coat that blended into the landscape so well she often seemed to appear out of the air rather than from it. This morning, however, she looked as if the desert itself had drained something from her. Her sides rose and fell too fast. Her ears twitched at the smallest sounds, then flattened again. She stared at the cubs with a look that didn't settle into anything recognizable. Not tenderness or anger, not fear or relief, just distance. The birth had happened before sunrise, hidden under the same mesquite tree, while the stars still held the sky. It had taken longer than it should have. The reserve was quiet at night, but quiet doesn't mean gentle. Coyotes moved like smoke beyond the ridgeline. A distant owl watched from a dead branch. Somewhere far off, a herd of pronghorns shifted as if they'd felt something change in the air. Luna had chosen this spot for shelter. Low branches, thick shade, the trunk at her back like a wall. She had done what lionesses do, disappeared from the Pride Center, found a quiet place, tried to bring new life into a world that rarely waited for anyone to catch their breath. Yet when it was over, when 3 small bodies finally arrived and the morning began to brighten, there was no soft miracle in her face. For most creatures, the first moments are instinct. The cleaning, the nudging, the warmth offered without hesitation. A mother's body becomes a safe place before the world can become a threat. But Luna only stood there, trembling faintly, looking down at the cubs as if they were not fully real. As if she were seeing something else, something heavy and unspoken, layered over them like a shadow only she could feel. The cubs wriggled. One pushed its nose into the sand, searching blindly for milk, for comfort, for the familiar rhythm of a mother's heartbeat. Another lifted its head with a weak wobble, mouth opening in a tiny cry that cracked in the dry air and fell apart before it could travel. The third, smallest of all, barely moved, saving whatever life it could hold onto, its sides fluttering like thin paper in the wind. Luna did not answer. Minutes stretched. The sun edged higher. The ground began to warm, not kindly, but quickly, heat rising from stone and dirt the way it always did in this part of Texas, as if the land itself remembered every harsh summer it had ever survived. A hawk circled above, patient as time. A beetle crossed the sand near the cubs and disappeared into a crack. Luna's gaze shifted once to the horizon, and in that small movement there was something that felt like a decision. Not thoughtful, not right or wrong, not cruel, just a door quietly closing. She took a step. Her paws sank slightly into the loose sand. Her shoulders rolled with the slow, tired grace of an animal built for endurance. She paused for a heartbeat. The faintest hesitation, like the world offering her one last chance to turn back. The cubs, sensing movement, squirmed harder. One reached out, a tiny paw stretching toward the place where warmth had been. Its paw didn't find fur. It found air. Luna took another step and another. She didn't look back. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like she didn't care, but not caring has a certain ease to it, a casualness. This was something else. Luna moved like a lioness carrying a weight no one could see, like the part of her that was supposed to connect had slipped out of place, and her body was following rules her heart could no longer reach. Far across the reserve, in a small control room built into a low hidden building, a bank of monitors glowed in the dim light. Mara Caldwell, a field tech in her late 20s with sunburned freckles and a tired ponytail, leaned forward until her nose was almost touching the screen. The image was grainy, tinted slightly by the early light, but clear enough to show three tiny shapes under the mesquite and the pale silhouette of Luna stepping away. Mara's hand hovered over her headset as if she could physically stop what she was seeing. Beside her, Dr. Evan Mercer, the reserve's consulting biologist, stood with his arms folded tight. He had spent his life studying predator behavior, charts, patterns, probabilities. He knew what abandonment could mean in the wild. He knew how quickly a morning could turn deadly for something that couldn't even lift its head. Still, his voice came out lower than usual, as though the desert had pressed it down. "Is she leaving them?" Mara asked, though she already knew the answer. Evan didn't reply right away. His eyes stayed on the screen, on the line of Luna's body growing smaller with each step. On the way the cub's movements looked frantic and slow at the same time, like sparks struggling against damp wood. "She's walking off," he said finally. "No circling, no returning." Mara swallowed hard. "That doesn't make sense." "Sometimes it does," Evan said, and the words sounded like they belonged to someone older than him. "Sometimes the body makes a choice the mind can't explain." On the monitor, Luna reached a stretch of taller grass and passed into it, her coat disappearing until there was only a faint ripple where she'd gone. Then even that was gone. The mesquite tree remained alone against the widening light. And beneath it, the three cubs lay exposed, not only to heat, but to the simple truth of the world. Newborns do not negotiate with nature. Mara's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "We can't," she started, then stopped. The reserve's rules were strict. They didn't interfere. That was the point of this place, to let the wild be wild, to document without changing the story. But there was a difference between watching a hunt and watching abandonment. One felt like life doing what life does. The other felt like a promise broken before it was even made. Evan reached for his radio, then hesitated. If they moved people in, vehicles and voices, they could scare everything. Luna, the pride, even the cubs if somehow Luna returned. Human scent could linger for days. Stepping in could ripple outward in ways they couldn't predict. And yet on the screen, the smallest cub shivered and made a thin sound that sounded almost like a question. Mara whispered, not to Evan, not to anyone in the room, but to the image itself. "Come back, Luna, please." The desert did not answer. The sun climbed another inch, and the shadow under the mesquite shrank. The cubs' bodies, so new they still seemed like they belonged to the night, began to warm too fast. Their tiny mouths opened and closed as if calling for something they couldn't name. One crawled a few inches, bumping into the others, then collapsed. Another lifted its head, held it there for a second, and let it fall again, as if the effort cost more than it had to give. Evan exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding his breath since before the cubs were born. "There's one other factor," he said, his voice careful, measured. "The pride's male." Mara looked at him. "Caleb." Evan nodded once. The name carried weight, even in a room full of science. Caleb, the dominant male of Red Mesa's pride. 8 years old, massive, experienced, a lion built like a boundary line. He patrolled with the confidence of something that had won too many arguments to doubt itself. He protected the territory because it was his. He tolerated the lionesses because they were part of that territory. And cubs were the future, yes, but also a complication, a fragile set of vulnerabilities that most dominant males left to the mothers. What would he do? Mara asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the answer. Evan didn't soften his gaze. "Depends on what he decides those cubs are." On the monitor, the camera angle shifted to a wider view as another sensor turned on. It showed a line of rocky outcropping farther down the wash where a patch of shade still held. A large shape moved there slowly at first, then with the deliberate certainty of something that had heard a sound it couldn't ignore. A lion stood up in the shade. Even through a camera, Caleb looked unreal. His mane was darker than most, thick around his neck like storm clouds gathered into fur. He shook once, dust lifting from his shoulders, and the morning light caught the edges of his mane with a copper glint. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. Every step he took carried the unspoken message of a ruler moving through his own world. His head turned slightly, ears angling toward the faintest noise, the weak, desperate calls drifting on the wind from the mesquite tree. Then he started walking. Mara felt her stomach tighten as if her body understood the danger before her mind could reason it out. "No," she breathed. Evan's hand hovered over the radio again. His jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was fighting a battle that didn't appear on any map. On the screen, Caleb crossed open ground, his paws soundless in the sand. The sun rose behind him, outlining his frame in gold. For a moment, he looked almost like a myth, like something out of a story people told children to explain fear. And the smallest cub under the mesquite lifted its head again, mouth open, calling into the empty air. In the control room, Mara's voice trembled, not with panic, but with the fragile kind of hope that hurts. "Evan, if he reaches them." Evan's eyes never left the monitor. He swallowed once, and when he finally spoke, it was in a voice so quiet it sounded like a prayer. "Watch," he said. "Just watch." And as Caleb's shadow stretched long across the sand, Mara pressed her headset closer and whispered the only words she could think to say, words that would carry them into whatever came next. "Caleb, please don't." Caleb moved with the calm authority of a lion who had never needed to rush. Each step carried him farther from the shade of the rocks and closer to the mesquite tree where the 3 cubs lay exposed. their faint cries barely audible over the whisper of wind sliding across the desert floor. His mane shifted with his shoulders, heavy and dark, framing a face marked by old scars, records of past fights settled long before this morning. This was his land. Every sound, every scent, every movement belonged to a map etched into his mind. From the control room, Mara leaned forward again, her breath shallow. She could see the cubs clearly now, the camera zoom adjusting as Caleb closed the distance. Their small bodies twitched in uneven rhythms, energy draining faster than it could be replaced. The largest of the three managed a thin, broken cry. The smallest barely stirred, its sides fluttering too quickly, too lightly. Dr. Evan Mercer's voice came through the room, low and steady, as if speaking aloud might help him organize what he knew. In most cases, he said almost to himself, a dominant male finding unattended cubs will see them as a risk, a drain on resources, or worse, an unknown variable. Mara didn't look away from the screen. You mean he might? He might kill them, Evan finished quietly. Not out of cruelty, out of logic. Logic. The word sat heavy in the air. In the wild, logic was simple and unforgiving. A lion like Caleb existed to hold territory. Territory meant food. Food meant survival, not just for him, but for the pride that depended on his strength to keep rival males away. Cubs were the future, yes, but only if they were protected by their mothers, fed properly, and brought into the structure of the pride. Unattended cubs represented weakness. They attracted predators. They distracted lionesses from hunting. They created vulnerabilities other males could exploit. And in many places in nature, vulnerability did not get second chances. On the monitor, Caleb slowed as he reached the edge of the mesquite's shadow. His head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as he drew in the scents layered thickly around the tree. Dust, dry leaves, the faint, unmistakable smell of new life. Beneath it all, another scent lingered. Luna's, fresh, unsettled, mixed with something sharp that spoke of stress and exhaustion rather than calm motherly certainty. Caleb's tail flicked once. Mara felt her chest tighten. He knows they're hers, she said, more statement than question. Yes, Evan replied. He knows. That knowledge, however, did not guarantee mercy. Male lions recognized their offspring often enough. Recognition did not require care. In the unspoken rules of their world, fatherhood rarely meant presence. It meant genetics passed forward, nothing more. Caleb took another step, then another. He stopped less than 10 feet from the cubs. From this close, the contrast was brutal. His massive frame loomed like a living cliff over three bodies so small they barely seemed real. His shadow crept forward, swallowing the sand inch by inch, until it reached the cub's paws. One of them reacted instinctively, wriggling toward the darkness of that shadow as if it offered safety. Its tiny nose pressed into the cooler ground, searching. Caleb did not move. Seconds passed. The desert held its breath. Somewhere far off, a cicada buzzed and fell silent. A cloud crossed the sun briefly, then drifted on, the heat returning with renewed force. In the control room, no one spoke. Mara's hand hovered near the console, fingers trembling with the urge to do something, anything that might change what was about to happen. Evan's gaze remained fixed, his expression unreadable, carved from years of watching nature refuse to bend. "This is the moment," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where instinct decides." On the screen, Caleb lowered his head. His muzzle came closer to the cubs, close enough that his breath stirred the fine dust around them. He sniffed once, slowly, deliberately, as though reading a story written in scent alone. He nudged the sand near them with his nose, not touching, not yet. The largest cub responded with a weak, hopeful sound. Mara squeezed her eyes shut for half a second, then forced them open again. She didn't want to miss whatever came next, even if it hurt to watch. Caleb's ears shifted backward, then forward again. His eyes, golden, steady, ancient, moved from one cub to the next. He was still, completely still. No tension coiled in his muscles. No sign of immediate aggression. But neither was there the softness people wanted to believe in. Evan inhaled slowly. "A lion doesn't hesitate without reason," he murmured. "But hesitation isn't the same as compassion." From years of observation, he knew what often followed moments like this. A swift, decisive action, a correction to an imbalance, a return to order. Caleb's jaws parted slightly. Mara's breath caught, but instead of snapping shut, instead of the sharp final movement everyone feared, Caleb closed his mouth again. His head lifted just a fraction. His body shifted, not forward, but downward. He sat. The motion was controlled, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. When his hindquarters settled into the sand, his massive body cast a wide, solid shadow that rolled over the cubs like a wave. The temperature beneath the mesquite dropped instantly. The cubs reacted at once, their movements changing, becoming less frantic. One of them crawled blindly toward the nearest solid warmth and bumped into Caleb's front leg. In the control room, Mara gasped softly. "He's sitting with them." Evan didn't answer right away. He leaned closer to the screen, eyes narrowed, studying details that might reveal what this really meant. "He hasn't committed," he said finally. "Not yet." But something had shifted. Even without touching them, Caleb had changed the situation. The cubs were no longer fully exposed. They were no longer alone under the sun. For the first time since Luna walked away, something larger than themselves acknowledged their existence. Caleb remained where he was, unmoving. The cub that had reached his leg pressed against it weakly, instinct drawing it toward the steady heat of muscle and bone. Caleb looked down at it, his expression unreadable, then turned his gaze outward, scanning the open land beyond the tree. His posture was alert now, not tense but aware, a guardian stance, though no one in the room dared call it that yet. Mara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, surprising her with their suddenness. "Why would he do this?" she whispered. "It doesn't make sense." Evan watched the screen, his mind racing through explanations that felt thin even as he formed them. Territorial instinct, curiosity about senses, temporary tolerance. Any of them could fit. None of them explained the way Caleb stayed seated, refusing to move even as the sun climbed higher and the day pressed on. "Sometimes," Evan said slowly, choosing each word with care, "behavior changes when the cost of doing nothing becomes visible." On the monitor, the smallest cub stirred at last, drawn by the shift in temperature. It made a soft, raspy sound and rolled slightly onto its side, closer to Caleb's shadow. Its breathing eased just a little. Caleb did not touch it. He didn't need to. He stayed. And in staying, he created a new problem. One far more complex than the one instinct was designed to solve. Because shade was not milk, protection was not food. And the longer Caleb remained there, the more the world would notice. In the distance, unseen by the cameras, scavengers moved. Other lionesses rested and watched the land with quiet awareness. Luna herself walked alone, unaware or unwilling to know what was unfolding behind her. Evan lowered his arms, tension finally seeping into his posture. "If he leaves," he said, "they won't last another hour." "And if he stays?" Mara asked. Evan's eyes never left the screen where Caleb still sat, immovable as stone, 3 fragile lives pressed against the edge of his shadow. "Then he's already crossed a line," Evan replied. "And there's no clear path back." Caleb lifted his head and let out a low sound. Not a roar, not a threat, but a deep vibration that carried across the desert floor. It rolled outward, touching rocks and grass and empty air alike, as if announcing something without words. Mara felt a chill run through her despite the heat. "What was that?" she asked. Evan exhaled, slow and deliberate. "That," he said, "wasn't instinct reacting." On the screen, Caleb's gaze swept the horizon once more, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was something unmistakable in his posture. Not dominance, not calculation, but resolve. And far beyond the mesquite tree, beyond the cameras and the quiet observers, the land began to respond. The low vibration of Caleb's call faded into the open land, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than sound. Dust settled. The cicadas resumed their faint rhythm. Under the mesquite, the cubs remained pressed close to the edge of his shadow, their movements slower now, guided less by panic and more by instinctive seeking. They did not know what had changed, only that the burning sky had retreated and something solid had entered their fragile world. Caleb did not shift when the smallest cub nudged farther, its nose brushing the rough fur of his front leg. The contact was accidental, clumsy, the kind that newborns make without intention. Still, it happened, and when it did, Caleb's muscles tightened, not in aggression, but in awareness. He looked down again, closer this time, his breath warm against the cub's back. In the control room, Mara covered her mouth with one hand, afraid that even a soundless gasp might somehow carry across the miles of land between her and the tree. Dr. Mercer leaned forward until his reflection merged with the image on the screen. This was no longer a theoretical moment. Whatever Caleb did next would not be undone. Caleb lowered his head, not abruptly, not with the sharp economy of a predator closing distance. He moved slowly, deliberately, his massive skull descending until his nose hovered inches above the cubs. He inhaled once, deeply, then again. He smelled them properly now, not as an abstract scent carried on the wind, but as individual lives, warm skin, faint milkless breath, the unmistakable chemical signature of new birth. Recognition settled in. The largest cub twitched and let out a thin, reedy sound. The middle one stirred beside it, legs paddling weakly in the sand. The smallest, exhausted by effort, simply leaned into Caleb's leg and went still, its breathing shallow but steady. Caleb's ears flicked backward, then forward. His whiskers brushed the air just above the cubs as he exhaled slowly. For a long moment, nothing happened. No decisive action. No release of tension. Just a massive animal suspended in the space between what was expected and what was unfolding. Then Caleb did something that defied every clean explanation Dr. Mercer had ever taught. He shifted his weight, not away from the cubs, but closer. His body angled subtly, deliberately, until the cubs were no longer at the edge of his shadow, but fully within it. The shade deepened. The sand beneath them cooled further. The cubs responded immediately, their tiny bodies inching toward the center of that darkness as if it were the safest place in the world. Caleb lay down, not flat, not sprawled. He lowered himself carefully onto one side, front leg bent, hind leg extended, creating a curved wall of muscle and fur. His massive chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. The cubs, blind and desperate, followed that rhythm without understanding it. One pressed against his chest. Another rested against the inside of his front leg. The smallest rolled until its back touched the warmth of his belly, then stopped moving altogether, conserving energy. Mara's breath left her in a shaky exhale. "Oh my God," she whispered. He's lying with them." Evan did not respond right away. He was watching Caleb's face, watching for tension, for the telltale signs of a decision reversed. He saw none. Caleb's eyes were open, alert, scanning the horizon beyond the mesquite. His head lifted slightly, mane stirring as he turned, checking the wind. This was not rest. This was vigilance. "He's positioning," Evan said at last, disbelief threading through his professional calm. "He's not just tolerating them. He's protecting them from threats." The words felt unreal even as he spoke them. Out in the reserve, the sun continued its climb, but the cubs no longer bore its full force. Their breathing evened out, their movement slowed from frantic to purposeful. They were still in danger, desperately so, but the immediate spiral toward death had been interrupted. Caleb remained motionless, save for the slow turn of his head as he monitored the open ground. A distant shape moved along a ridge, too far to identify clearly, but close enough to register. Caleb's gaze fixed on it, his lips pulled back slightly, exposing the edges of his teeth in a silent warning no one else could hear. The shape retreated. Caleb relaxed just enough to breathe deeply again. Minutes passed, then more. Time behaved differently now, stretching and compressing around this impossible scene. The cubs slept in fits and starts, waking only to shift closer to warmth. One of them, the middle cub, lifted its head at last and bumped clumsily into Caleb's chest. Its tiny mouth opened and closed reflexively, searching for milk that wasn't there. Caleb froze. This time, tension rippled visibly through him. His muscles tightened. His ears flattened. For a fraction of a second, Evan feared this was where the line would be drawn, where reality would reassert itself, and the story would end the way stories like this always did. But Caleb did not snap. He did not stand. He did not retreat. Instead, he lifted his head and looked down at the cub again. The cub's mouth brushed his fur, found nothing, and released a weak sound of frustration before dropping its head back onto the sand. Caleb exhaled, slow and controlled. His tail flicked once, cutting a thin line in the dust. Then he did something smaller than lying down, smaller than calling, but just as telling. He stayed still. That choice, to not correct the cub, to not move away from the discomfort of closeness, settled something unspoken. Caleb was no longer simply reacting to the situation. He was allowing it. In the control room, Evan lowered himself into a chair without realizing he had done so. "This isn't temporary," he said quietly. "He's committing time." Mara's eyes were glassy, fixed on the screen. "But why?" she asked again. "What changes a lion like that?" Evan shook his head slowly. "Sometimes the question isn't what changes them," he said. "It's what finally reaches them." On the monitor, the camera shifted angles as another sensor activated, tracking Luna's position miles away. She moved along a dry wash alone, pausing to drink from a shallow pool before continuing on without hesitation. She did not turn back. Whatever had broken in her remained broken for now. Back under the mesquite, Caleb adjusted his posture minutely, lifting his chest just enough to create a deeper pocket of shade. The cubs responded, drawn closer together, their bodies forming a small cluster against his side. The smallest cub let out a faint sound. Not a cry, but something softer, almost content. Caleb's eyes flicked down at it again. This time, his gaze lingered. No one watching could say what passed through his mind. Lions did not narrate their decisions. They did not explain. But something unmistakable had occurred. The cubs were no longer objects in his territory. They were variables he had chosen to keep. The afternoon pressed on. Heat shimmered above the ground beyond the tree. Insects gathered and dispersed. Life continued its quiet negotiation around this anomaly. Caleb remained, and in remaining he created a new reality, one that demanded answers he did not yet have. Shade would not last forever. The cubs would wake hungry. Other members of the pride would notice. Predators would test boundaries. The cost of this decision would rise with every passing hour. Caleb lifted his head again and released another low sound, deeper this time, more deliberate. It was not a roar. It carried no threat. It was a signal shaped by need rather than dominance. Far across the reserve, ears lifted, heads turned. Something was being asked of the world, and whether the world would answer was no longer entirely up to instinct. The call Caleb had sent into the land did not echo forever. It dissolved into heat and distance, leaving behind the steady reality of the afternoon. Under the mesquite, time resumed its slow, relentless movement. The cubs slept, then stirred, slept again. Each time they woke, their small bodies searched for something the shadow and warmth could not give. Hunger announced itself quietly at first. The largest cub shifted and pressed its mouth again against Caleb's fur, more insistently now. Its jaw worked with fragile determination, the instinct to nurse hardwired and urgent. The middle cub followed, bumping clumsily into its sibling, tiny paws kneading at nothing. The smallest cub remained still for a long moment longer than the others, then let out a thin sound, less a cry than a thread of breath pulled too tight. Caleb stiffened. His muscles tightened beneath his coat, not in anger, but in recognition of a problem with no clear solution. He lifted his head and looked down at the cubs, their mouths opening and closing against his body, finding no answer there. Shade had slowed their decline. Warmth had steadied their breathing, but neither could feed them. Neither could replace what Luna had taken with her when she walked away. Caleb rose carefully to his feet. For a split second, panic rippled through the control room. Mara's hand flew to her mouth again. Dr. Mercer's shoulders tensed, every instinct in him bracing for retreat, for abandonment repeating itself in a different form. But Caleb did not step away. He stood, turned slightly, and repositioned himself so that his body once again blocked the sun at its sharpest angle. Then he sat back down, closer than before, forcing the cubs into deeper shade. The movement was deliberate, measured. It bought them time, but only time. In the distance, clouds gathered along the horizon, tall and pale, promising nothing. The air thickened with heat. Even the wind seemed to tire, dropping into long, breathless pauses. This was the part of the day when the desert tested everything that lived in it. Caleb lifted his head and scanned the land. His gaze moved from ridge to ridge, noting the positions of rocks, brush, and open ground. He was calculating now, not just guarding. The cubs were no longer passive elements in his territory. They were liabilities he had accepted, and liabilities drew attention. Far away, a vulture circled lazily, too high to pose an immediate threat, but close enough to register. Caleb's lips pulled back in a silent snarl. The bird drifted farther off. In the control room, Evan's voice broke the quiet. "They won't last," he said, not as a prediction, but as a statement of fact. "Not without milk." Mara nodded, tears blurring her view of the screen. "He knows that, doesn't he?" "Yes," Evan said softly. "That's what makes this worse. He's intelligent enough to understand the gap." As if responding to that truth, Caleb's posture changed again. He leaned forward, ears angling outward, and released another sound, deeper than before, longer, carrying farther across the reserve. It was not the roar he used to warn rivals or show dominance. This was something else. The sound wavered slightly, shaped to travel rather than intimidate. A call. The cubs startled at the vibration, then settled again, drawn back into the shelter of his body. Caleb held the sound for several seconds before letting it fade naturally into the heat. Miles away, in scattered patches of shade and rest, lionesses lifted their heads. Grace was the first to respond. She had been lying near a cluster of rocks with two younger females, conserving energy through the worst of the afternoon. Grace was older than most, her movements slower now, her face marked by years of hunts and losses. She had raised cubs before, more than one litter, and had buried some of them, too. Experience lived in her bones. When Caleb's call reached her, she did not rise immediately. She listened. The sound carried urgency without threat, need without command. It was unfamiliar. Grace stood, stretched once, and turned in the direction of the mesquite. The other lionesses hesitated, exchanging glances, reading cues from posture and scent. Eventually, they followed, not rushing, but attentive. Back under the tree, the cubs grew restless. Hunger sharpened their movements. The largest cub attempted to lift itself fully upright and failed, collapsing with a soft thump into the sand. The smallest began to shiver again, the earlier calm slipping away. Caleb lowered his head and nudged the sand near them, a small corrective gesture meant to draw them closer together. They responded weakly, pressing into one another, their tiny bodies forming a fragile knot against his side. Minutes stretched unbearably long. In the control room, Evan clenched his hands together. "If no one answers that call," Mara said quickly, though she had no evidence to support the certainty in her voice, "someone will." The land shifted. Movement appeared at the edge of the camera's frame. First one shape, then another. Lionesses emerged from the heat shimmer, their coats pale against the dust. Caleb saw them before the cameras adjusted. He rose to his feet, head high, mane lifting slightly in the breeze that returned with their approach. Grace stepped forward. She stopped several yards away, assessing the scene. Her eyes flicked from Caleb to the cubs and back again. The scent of Luna lingered strongly now, unmistakable. Grace's ears tilted backward briefly, then forward. Understanding passed through her posture, subtle but clear. She advanced another step. Caleb did not move to block her. He remained standing, but shifted just enough to give her a clear view of the cubs. It was an invitation without words. Grace lowered her head and sniffed the air. Then she approached the cubs themselves, her movement slow, careful, non-threatening. She bent her neck and examined them one by one, her nose brushing their fur lightly, cataloging their condition with practiced efficiency. The cubs reacted instinctively to her scent. They stirred, mouths opening again, cries gaining strength. Grace hesitated. This was the moment everything balanced on. Adoption among lionesses was not unheard of, but it was rare, dependent on timing, condition, and social stability. Grace already had cubs of her own, older now, less dependent, but still nursing occasionally. Accepting more mouths would cost her energy she could not easily spare. Caleb stood over them all, silent and immovable. Grace made her decision. She lay down. The movement was unmistakable, deliberate. She positioned herself so that her flank faced the cubs, her body forming a protective curve alongside Caleb's. The cubs reacted instantly, drawn by scent and instinct, crawling toward her with renewed urgency. One found her first, mouth latching clumsily, then firmly. The second followed. The third, smallest of all, took longer, but eventually found its way. Milk. Life surged back into them in small, desperate pulls. Their bodies relaxed as nourishment reached places warmth alone could not. Their cries softened into quiet sounds of effort and relief. In the control room, Mara collapsed back into her chair, tears streaming freely now. She accepted them, she whispered. Evan closed his eyes briefly, the tension draining from his face. Yes, he said. She did. Caleb remained standing for several seconds longer, watching closely, ensuring the cubs were truly feeding, truly safe. Only when their movements slowed and their bodies settled did he lower himself to the ground nearby, close enough to shield them, far enough to give Grace space. The crisis of the moment had passed, but the cost of what Caleb had set in motion was only beginning to reveal itself. Because by calling the pride, by staying, by insisting on life where death would have been easier, Caleb had altered the structure of his world. The cubs were no longer an isolated anomaly. They were now part of the pride's responsibility, and responsibility in the wild always demanded payment. Caleb lifted his head once more and scanned the horizon. The sun edged lower, shadows stretching long again. Evening would bring cooler air, and with it new dangers. The cubs fed quietly, unaware that their survival had just rewritten the rules that governed them. The desert did not celebrate small victories. It absorbed them and waited. As the sun slipped lower, its heat loosening its grip on the land, the quiet around the mesquite shifted into something watchful. The cubs fed until their movements slowed, their bodies finally heavy with something close to relief. One by one, they loosened their grip and sagged against Grace's side, milk-drunk and exhausted. Their breathing evened out, shallow but steady, tiny chests rising and falling in a fragile rhythm that no longer felt like it might stop at any second. Grace remained still, alert despite her stillness. Her ears pivoted constantly, tracking sounds beyond sight. She had accepted the cubs, but acceptance did not mean blindness. It meant vigilance. It meant knowing that every extra life she fed would ripple outward, drawing attention. Caleb watched from a short distance away, his body positioned where he could see both the open land and the cluster beneath the tree. He did not rest. He could not. The decision to stay, to call the pride, to insist on survival, had moved them all into a different phase, one where consequences would arrive quickly and without apology. The first sign came with the wind. A faint shift in scent rolled across the ground, barely noticeable, but enough to tighten Caleb's posture. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, his tail stilled. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, something had noticed what he was protecting. In the control room, Dr. Evan Mercer straightened in his chair. "We've got movement on the north sensors," he said quietly. Mara leaned closer to the screen, her earlier relief draining into unease. "What kind of movement?" "Too coordinated to be nothing," Evan replied. "Could be hyenas." The word landed hard. Hyenas were opportunists, brilliant and relentless. They were not afraid of testing boundaries, especially when they sensed weakness or distraction. Newborn cubs, nursing lionesses, a male who had changed his routine, it was the kind of imbalance hyenas were drawn to like heat-seeking missiles. Out on the land, Caleb rose slowly to his feet. Grace noticed immediately. Her body tensed, muscles ready to spring if needed, but she did not stand. Leaving the cubs, even for a moment, could undo everything. Instead, she shifted slightly, angling herself so her body shielded them more completely. Her flank pressed into the earth. The cubs slept on, unaware. Caleb stepped forward, away from the tree. He did not go far, just enough to place himself between the mesquite and the direction of the scent. His shoulders squared, his mane lifted subtly, catching what little breeze remained. This posture was different from the calm authority he usually carried. This was sharper, more focused. The posture of a line drawn in the sand. The hyenas did not appear right away. They never did. They tested first. A sound, soft, chattering, almost playful, drifted in from the distance. Then, another. The noise circled, bounced off rocks, slipped between brush. It was meant to confuse, to probe reactions. Caleb answered with a roar. This one was unmistakable. It tore through the cooling air, deep and thunderous, carrying dominance, threat, and promise all at once. Birds exploded from nearby trees. The cubs startled, then settled again as Grace pressed her body lower over them. For a moment, it seemed like enough. In the control room, Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They'll back off," she said, needing it to be true. Evan didn't answer. On the screen, movement flickered at the edge of visibility. Shapes detached themselves from shadow and resolved into forms. 3, then 4, then 5 hyenas, keeping their distance, their bodies low but confident. They did not scatter. They slowed. They were calculating. Caleb took a step forward, then another, placing more distance between the threat and the tree. He wanted them to focus on him. He wanted their attention pulled away from the cubs. This was not how he usually fought. This was not about territory or dominance displays. This was positioning, pure and simple. One of the hyenas laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the dusk. Caleb roared again and charged. The ground shook beneath his weight as he closed the distance in a burst of controlled power. The hyenas scattered instantly, darting backward, their movements quick and fluid. They did not flee outright. They spread out, trying to split his focus, testing how far he would go from what he guarded. Caleb stopped short, refusing the trap. He pivoted, keeping all of them in view, his body a living barrier. His teeth flashed white and final in the fading light. The standoff stretched. Minutes passed, then more. The temperature dropped as evening settled fully in, shadows thickening into darkness. The hyenas edged closer again, emboldened by numbers, by patience. Grace watched from beneath the mesquite, her eyes never leaving Caleb's back. She could smell his tension now, sharp and metallic, mingling with dust and milk and fear. If he fell, If he was injured badly enough, the equation would change instantly. Hyenas knew that, too. Caleb took another step forward, this time not charging, but asserting presence. He lowered his head slightly, eyes locked on the nearest hyena. The message was clear. Come closer, and you will not leave. The hyenas hesitated. Then finally, something shifted in their calculus. The cost began to outweigh the reward. One by one, they eased backward, still watching, still laughing softly, but retreating into the dark. Caleb did not relax until they were gone. Only when the last sound faded did he turn and walk back toward the mesquite, his movements slower now, the effort of restraint visible in the way his shoulders rolled. He paused once, glancing over his shoulder, ensuring the land had truly emptied. Grace lifted her head slightly as he approached. Caleb stopped a few feet away, lowered himself to the ground, and lay facing outward once more. He positioned himself so that his body formed a second barrier beyond Grace, creating layers of protection that would have seemed absurd to anyone who knew what male lions were supposed to do. The cubs stirred briefly, sensing his return, then settled again, their small bodies pressed together in a loose cluster of warmth and breath. In the control room, Evan leaned back, exhaustion etched into his face. That was the first payment, he said quietly. Mara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And it won't be the last, will it? No, Evan replied. Every night, every challenge, every shift in the balance, it will come again and again. On the screen, Caleb lifted his head one last time and scanned the dark, stars beginning to appear above him. His chest rose and fell steadily now, but the tension had not left him. It had simply found a new place to live. He had chosen this. The cubs slept, unaware that their survival had already caused bloodless battles, and would soon demand more. Grace closed her eyes briefly, resting without surrendering awareness. The pride had adapted, but adaptation came with strain. As the night deepened and the desert cooled, a new truth settled into the land around the mesquite. Staying was no longer an act of mercy. It was an ongoing commitment. And Caleb, lying awake beneath the stars, understood that the hardest part of his choice was not the moment he made it. It was everything that would follow. The desert night did not soften the world. It sharpened it. Cold slid in quietly, settling over red mesa like a held breath. The heat of the day bled out of the ground, leaving behind stone that remembered the sun, but no longer offered comfort. Stars scattered across the sky in ruthless clarity. And every sound, every scrape of claw against rock, every distant call, carried farther than it had any right to. Caleb did not sleep. He lay facing the open land, his body a dark mass against the pale sand, ears moving constantly as the night spoke around him. Behind him, beneath the mesquite, Grace remained curled protectively around the cubs. They had fed again before nightfall, briefly, just enough to quiet their hunger, and now they slept deeply, their small bodies rising and falling in unsteady synchrony. They were alive. That was still not something anyone could afford to take for granted. Caleb's muscles ached, not from the encounter with the hyenas, though that tension still lived under his skin, but from the sustained vigilance that followed. This was not how nights usually went. Normally, he would patrol the boundaries of his territory, leaving the pride to rest behind him, secure in the knowledge that his presence somewhere out there was enough. Tonight, he stayed close. Too close. In the control room, the lights were dimmed to reduce glare on the monitors. Mara sat hunched over her station, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to keep warm through glass and distance. Dr. Evan Mercer stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the live feed. They had stopped speaking much. There were no explanations left to offer, only observation. The first sign of trouble came not as sound, but as absence. The insects fell silent. Caleb felt it immediately. His body shifted, weight transferring forward, claws flexing into the sand. The night grew too still, the kind of stillness that came before impact rather than peace. His head lifted, eyes narrowing, scanning the slope beyond the treeline. Then he smelled it. Not hyenas this time. Something heavier, something familiar in a different, more dangerous way. Male lions. Young ones. Two scents overlapping, sharp with ambition and hunger. Brothers, most likely, recently pushed from their natal pride, searching for territory, searching for weakness. Caleb had encountered their kind before, usually at the edges of his land, usually settled with roars and posturing before either side decided the cost was too high. But tonight the equation had changed. They were closer than they should have been. Caleb rose without hesitation and moved away from the mesquite, every step deliberate, controlled. He did not want them near the cubs, not even within sight. He placed himself on a slight rise where his silhouette would be visible against the stars, a clear signal. This land is taken. A roar ripped from his chest, louder than the one he had given the hyenas, deeper, layered with authority earned over years of dominance. It rolled across the desert, touching rock and brush, carrying a challenge that did not invite negotiation. The answer came quickly. A roar returned from the darkness, then another, higher pitched, younger, less stable. The sound of lions who believed strength could be measured simply by numbers. Grace stirred beneath the mesquite, her head lifted, ears flattening as she recognized the threat. She shifted her body instinctively, drawing the cubs closer, shielding them with her flank and front leg. One cub whimpered softly, then quieted again. Caleb did not look back. He moved forward, away from everything he was protecting. Each step an act of separation that cut against instinct as sharply as his earlier choice had. If the young males wanted to fight, they would have it here, not there. The darkness parted. Two shapes emerged. Manie's lighter and thinner than Caleb's. Their bodies lean with the hunger of exile. They moved with the reckless confidence of lions who had not yet learned how quickly confidence could turn fatal. Their eyes locked onto Caleb immediately, assessing, calculating, measuring distance and possibility. They circled. Caleb pivoted smoothly, keeping both in view, his movements economical despite the fatigue pressing into his limbs. This was not unfamiliar territory. He had fought before, many times, but never with this much at stake. One of the younger males lunged first. The impact was violent and sudden, bodies colliding with a force that sent dust into the air. Caleb met the charge head-on, his weight and experience turning the attack aside. The second male tried to flank him immediately, teeth snapping for an opening. Caleb twisted, shouldering one away while swiping at the other, claws catching fur, drawing a sharp, bright line of pain. The night exploded with sound, roars, snarls, the brutal percussion of muscle against muscle. In the control room, Mara's hands flew to her headset. "They're engaging," she said, her voice tight. "Two of them." Evan's jaw clenched. "He's outnumbered." On the screen, the fight surged back and forth. The younger males coordinated better than hyenas ever could, alternating attacks, testing Caleb's endurance. They were fast, they were relentless, and they knew exactly what they were risking, because the prize was enormous. Caleb fought with a ferocity that went beyond territorial defense. This was not about holding ground. This was about buying time. He absorbed blows that would have sent a lesser lion retreating, turning his body to protect his throat, his legs driving him forward again and again, despite the burning ache in his muscles. He roared into the face of one attacker, teeth flashing inches from flesh, then spun to drive the other backward with a crushing blow of his shoulder. Minutes stretched into something timeless. Blood marked the sand now, not enough to decide the fight, but enough to make the cost real. One of the younger males faltered, shaken by the intensity of resistance he had not expected. The other pressed harder, desperation edging into his movements. Caleb seized the opening. He lunged with everything he had left, jaws closing around the scruff of the larger brother's neck, not to kill, but to dominate. He held the grip just long enough for the message to land, just long enough for the younger lion to feel the full truth of what he faced. Then Caleb released him and stepped back. The brothers regrouped, panting, eyes wide, bodies bleeding from shallow but telling wounds. They could continue. They might even win eventually. But now they understood the cost. They hesitated. Caleb stood his ground, chest heaving, mane matted with sweat and dust, eyes burning with a resolve that did not waver. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He waited. Finally, the younger males backed away, slow and wary, never turning their backs fully as they melted into the darkness from which they had come. Only then did Caleb allow his body to shake. The adrenaline drained fast, leaving behind pain that bloomed in his shoulders and flank. He stood still for several long seconds, forcing his breathing to steady, forcing his legs to hold. Then, with measured steps, he turned and made his way back toward the mesquite. Grace saw him coming and lifted her head. Caleb stopped several yards away and lowered himself to the ground, exhaustion finally breaking through his control. He did not collapse, but the effort to remain upright was visible now. His breathing was ragged. His body bore fresh marks that would take time to heal. The cubs slept on, untouched by the violence that had raged so close to their fragile world. In the control room, Evan exhaled slowly, hands braced against the edge of the desk. That, he said quietly, wasn't territorial aggression. Mara wiped her face with trembling fingers. Then what was it? Evan's eyes stayed on Caleb's battered form, lying awake beneath the stars, positioned once again between danger and life. That, he said, was defense with no exit strategy. Outside, the night reclaimed its quiet. The stars burned steadily above, indifferent and eternal. Caleb did not sleep. Not yet. His body hurt. His future was uncertain. But the cubs breathed, small and steady, behind him. The price had arrived, and Caleb had paid it, without knowing how many more nights like this the world would demand. Morning did not announce itself with drama. It arrived slowly, thinning the darkness until shapes reappeared one by one. The mesquite's crooked branches, the pale stretch of sand, the shallow impressions left by the night's violence. Cool air lingered close to the ground, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood and effort. The desert looked unchanged. It never showed its reactions openly. Caleb was still awake. He lay where he had settled hours earlier, body angled outward, guarding by habit now, rather than conscious choice. The sharpest pain had dulled into a deep, constant ache along his flank and shoulder. When he shifted, it was careful, measured. He had learned long ago which movements wasted strength, and which preserved it. Behind him, Grace stirred. She rose slowly, testing her weight, then stood fully. The cubs responded at once, wriggling and pressing closer, their small sounds stronger now than they had been the day before. Hunger had returned, but so had energy. They were no longer fighting simply to exist. They were beginning, in the smallest way, to expect. Grace lay down again, offering herself without hesitation. The cubs latched on quickly, more coordinated than before, their tiny paws kneading instinctively. Milk flowed. Life continued. Caleb watched from where he lay, eyes half-lidded, but alert. He did not intervene. He did not need to. His role had shifted again, subtly, without ceremony. He was no longer the anomaly at the edge of the scene. He was part of its structure. In the control room, Mara leaned back in her chair for the first time since the night before. She looked exhausted, eyes red, shoulders slumped, but there was a quiet steadiness in her posture now. "They made it through," she said softly. "For now," Evan replied. He had not slept either. He stood with a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hand, watching the feed with the focus of someone who knew that survival was not a moment. It was a pattern. Over the next days, that pattern began to take shape. Caleb did not return to his usual patrol routes. Instead, he shortened them, looping closer to the mesquite, keeping the area within sight or scent at all times. This adjustment rippled through the pride. Other lionesses noticed first, not because they questioned it, but because everything in their lives depended on reading changes in behavior. They adapted. Hunts were coordinated differently now, time to ensure that at least one experienced female remained nearby while Grace fed the cubs. Resting spots shifted. Movement became more deliberate, more clustered. The pride grew quieter, not from fear, but from focus. Caleb became a constant presence. When Grace needed to leave briefly with the others, he remained. He lay close enough that the cubs could crawl against his side, small bodies warming against muscle that no longer flinched at their touch. He tolerated their clumsy climbing, their sharp little teeth testing his mane, their paws batting at his whiskers. He did not encourage it, but he did not stop it either. This was not tenderness in the way humans understood it. It was allowance. And in the wild, allowance was powerful. One afternoon, as heat shimmered above the ground, Luna appeared at the edge of the clearing. She did not announce herself. She never did. She stood just beyond the shade, watching. Time had changed her, not visibly. Her body was strong, her movements fluid. But something in her posture was different. She was cautious now, in a way she had not been before. Her ears tilted forward as she took in the scene. Grace lying with the cubs themselves, larger already, more solid, and Caleb resting nearby, head lifted, gaze steady. Luna stepped closer. The cubs noticed her scent first. One lifted its head, nose twitching, curiosity stirring where instinct should have been stronger. Another followed suit, wobbling to its feet and taking a few uncertain steps before stopping. They did not rush her. They did not cry out. They watched. Luna stopped several yards away. She lowered herself to the ground slowly, carefully, as if testing whether the earth would accept her weight. Her eyes moved over the cubs, lingering a moment too long on the smallest one. Something tightened in her chest, something that might have been regret or recognition, or simply awareness of what had passed without her. She did not approach further. Grace did not growl. Caleb did not rise. There was no confrontation, no judgment. The pride did not operate that way. Roles were filled, or they were not. Luna's absence had been absorbed, compensated for, restructured around. After a few minutes, Luna stood and walked away again, disappearing into the brush as quietly as she had come. The cubs watched her go, then lost interest and returned to their clumsy play, tumbling over one another in the sand. Caleb shifted slightly, creating a broader patch of shade as the sun climbed higher. His body bore more scars now than it had days before, visible reminders of choices made without hesitation. But his movements had grown more efficient, his presence more grounded. Dr. Evan Mercer began to document the changes formally. What he recorded went beyond behavior logs and movement patterns. He noted timing, proximity, interaction. Caleb's involvement was not incidental. It was consistent, purposeful, measurable. When Grace left to hunt, Caleb stayed. When threats approached, Caleb intercepted. When cubs wandered too far, Caleb nudged them back, not with teeth, but with weight and positioning. This was not random. It looks learned, Mara said one evening, scrolling through footage, like he's adjusting. Evan nodded slowly. Or choosing, he said. Those aren't always different things. Weeks passed. The cubs grew. Their eyes opened, revealing the soft blue-gray of early life. Their legs strengthened. Their cries became louder, more demanding. They learned the boundaries of their world quickly. How far they could go before Grace's low warning sound called them back. How close they could get to Caleb before his sheer size blocked their path. They learned, too, that his presence meant safety. One evening, as shadows stretched long and the land cooled again, a distant sound carried across the reserve. A single hyena's laugh, far enough away to be only a suggestion. One cub froze mid-step. Another darted back toward Grace instinctively. The third, the smallest, ran straight toward Caleb. It pressed itself against his leg and stopped, heart racing, breath quick. Caleb did not look down at it right away. He scanned the horizon first, confirming distance and direction. Then, satisfied, he lowered his head and touched the cub lightly with his nose, just once. The cub stilled. In the control room, Mara felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized had been clenched for weeks. They trust him, she said quietly. Evan watched the screen, eyes thoughtful. They're learning from him, he replied. That's different. As summer deepened, the desert shifted again. Water grew scarcer. Prey patterns changed. Pressures mounted as they always did. But within the pride, something had stabilized. The cubs were no longer anomalies clinging to survival. They were part of a system that had adapted to include them. Caleb bore the quiet cost of that adaptation. He moved less, rested more. His injuries healed, but not completely. Old pain layered beneath new scars. Still, he did not retreat. He did not abandon the altered path he had chosen, because by now it was no longer just a choice. It was who he had become. Time did what it always did in the desert. It kept moving, indifferent to intention, carving its truth into bone and stone alike. Seasons turned with little ceremony. Summer gave way to a softer fall, then back again to heat that pressed down on Red Mesa with familiar weight. The cubs, once no more than fragile shapes beneath a mesquite, grew into something sturdier. Their bodies lengthened. Their paws grew heavy. Their play turned rougher, more confident, filled with mock charges and clumsy pounces that stirred dust into the air. Caleb watched all of it. He was older now. The change was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. His movements carried a fraction less speed. His recovery, after long days, took a little more time. The scars he had earned, old and new, remained etched into his frame, each one a quiet record of moments when leaving would have been easier than staying. The cubs did not know him as a legend or an anomaly. They knew him as presence. When they wandered too far, they found his body in their path before fear could find them. When the land grew loud with unfamiliar sounds, they clustered closer to him without instruction. They learned his rhythms, the way he scanned the horizon before resting, the way he positioned himself between danger and open ground, the way he chose when to move and when to wait. They learned without words that strength did not always mean forward motion. Dr. Evan Mercer's notes filled page after page. His observations had long since moved beyond curiosity. Patterns had emerged, measurable ones. Cubs raised in this altered structure showed different responses to threat, different closeness preferences, different tolerance for male presence. The data unsettled long-held assumptions, but the data was not what held him awake at night. It was the simplicity of it. No hormones had been injected. No boundaries had been forced by human hands. One lion had made a decision, and the world around him had adapted. Grace aged as well. Her muzzle grayed slightly, her steps slowed, but her authority remained unquestioned. She had given more than milk. She had given continuity. The pride functioned around her with the ease of something well practiced. Roles understood without conflict. Luna remained part of that system, though never again at its center. She hunted, she rested, she contributed, but she did not reclaim what she had lost. No force compelled her to, and no judgment followed her absence. The cubs acknowledged her scent, recognized her shape, but they did not seek her in moments of uncertainty. That bond had not been forged, and time did not pretend otherwise. Caleb did not watch her with accusation. He simply accepted the shape of what was. As the cubs approached adolescence, the land shifted again. Boundaries tightened. Distant roars carried new weight. The brothers who had once challenged Caleb did not return, but others tested the edges. Each encounter cost him more now. Each assertion required calculation rather than instinctive dominance. Caleb began to yield ground, not all at once, not in defeat, but with intention. He shortened patrols further. He allowed younger males to skirt the far edges of his territory without immediate challenge. It was not weakness, it was transition. He understood, perhaps without naming it, that survival sometimes meant choosing what not to fight. The cubs watched this, too. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon and shadows stretched long across the sand, Caleb climbed a low rise overlooking the heart of the reserve. The cubs, nearly grown now, followed, settling around him in a loose half-circle. They were quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding its full shape. Caleb sat, chest lifted, gaze fixed on the distance. He did not roar. He did not call. He simply remained there until the light faded. Weeks later, he was gone. There was no spectacle in his leaving, no final battle, no visible collapse. One morning, the pride woke, and his scent no longer anchored the air. The land felt different immediately, not wrong, but altered. Grace searched briefly, then stopped. She knew better than to expect explanations from a world that never offered them. Dr. Mercer and Mara tracked Caleb's movements for days through scattered signs, faint prints, a trail that led south, then vanished. When they finally found him weeks later, It was beneath a lone oak at the far edge of the reserve. He lay as if resting, body still, eyes closed, the marks of age and endurance etched into every line of him. There was no evidence of violence. He had chosen his end the way he had chosen everything else. Quietly, on his own terms. The cubs, no longer cubs now, did not witness his death. They did not need to. His absence shaped them as clearly as his presence had. In time, one of the males took on greater responsibility within the pride, positioning himself closer to the younger ones, intercepting threats earlier than expected. The behavior was subtle, easy to dismiss, unless you knew what to look for. Years passed. Red Mesa became a point of reference, then a case study. Researchers came and went. Papers were written, debated, revised. Some dismissed the story as an anomaly, a rare alignment of variables that meant nothing beyond itself. Others saw something more, evidence that learning, not just instinct, could ripple through generations. But beyond the data, the story traveled on its own. Visitors stood at the edge of observation platforms and listened as guides spoke of a lioness who walked away and a father who stayed. Parents watched their children grow quiet, eyes wide, absorbing the idea that family could be formed, not just by birth, but by decision. In the control room, now quieter than it once was, Mara watched footage of the next generation. Young lions moving with confidence, unafraid of male presence, quick to cluster when danger approached. She smiled softly, then wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by the habit she still hadn't broken. "Do you think he knew?" she asked Evan one evening. What he was starting. Evan considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I don't think it matters," he said. He didn't act for legacy. He acted because something in front of him needed him. On the land itself, the pride endured. Cubs were born. Some lived. Some did not. The world remained what it had always been, beautiful, brutal, indifferent. But within that world, a thread had been woven, subtle and strong. The cubs Caleb had protected grew into lions who understood that power could be still, that dominance did not always require destruction, that staying could be an act of strength rather than hesitation. And long after his body returned to the dust, that understanding remained, because in the end, territory changes hands. Strength fades. Even memory blurs. But what you choose to protect when no rule requires it can shape lives you will never see. Caleb had stayed, and that choice had outlived him. If this story stayed with you, even for a moment, let us know. Simply comment 1 if you believe staying when it's hard still matters. Or comment 0 if you think the world has forgotten that kind of strength. There are no right or wrong answers, only honest ones. And if you'd like to hear more true stories like this, stories about quiet courage, unexpected love, and lives changed by one choice, please consider subscribing. We'll be here waiting to share the next story with you.